Next up, let's go ahead and take a look at some of Substance Painter's actual painting features. So this isn't a painting course per se in the traditional sense, as we're not going to be going through classical painting techniques. However, if you are trained in classical painting techniques, then you'll be right at home with some of these features. The great thing about Substance Painter, and one of its most powerful attributes, is the fact that you don't have to have those classical painting techniques to texture an object. You can drag and drop and use smart masks and get some really realistic results that way with minimal painting. That being said, I think it's important to know the painting workflow, and despite not doing a classical painting workflow throughout this course series, we will be using the paintbrush quite a bit, and it's good to be familiar with the tool set. So in order to begin painting, or even to get access to the brush, you have to have a layer selected. So by default, it adds this layer. I'm going to delete that so I can show you the two main types of layer. We have a fill layer, which I discussed kind of previously, how this kind of has these preset attributes down here. And if you try and paint on a fill layer, you'll notice that you can't, that you can only kind of change this base color or plug textures into here. And if you want to paint on this fill layer, what you'll need to do is right click and add paint, and then you can go ahead and begin painting on that layer, and this will operate similarly to a paint layer. But what it will do is it will inherit the height information, normal information, and roughness information of that fill layer, which can be useful. A great example where this might be useful is if you were painting a wood texture and you had wood grain information in all of these and you wanted to paint colors on top and maintain. Let's go ahead and look at the other type of layer. So this is just called a layer. Let's go ahead and call this a paint test layer. And then if I come down here, we can see that we have all of our paintbrush options. So first of all, up here, we have our previews. And the great thing about this little paint preview is that you can actually click and drag to get an idea of what your paint will look like. Here to the right with our size and our flow, you see that you have options for pen pressure sensitivity. If you want to dial in that sensitivity, you have various ease modes up here to do so. So we have our size, our minimum size, our flow, our stroke opacity, which flow and opacity differentiate in the same way that they do in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and grab another brush here so that we can see some of the differences. So if you come here to the brushes, they have about every preset that you could imagine. So let's go ahead here and let's grab this kind of artistic print brush here. And when we drag here, we can see that we get that preview. And then here we have the ability to change that angle, and you can see how that is rotating that brush there. I'll grab something with a more obvious angle there. I'll grab this concept brush here. And if we go ahead here and rotate that angle, you can see that you can rotate the angle of the brush there. There's the option to follow the path so that you can get those angles to follow the path. Then down here we have all these jitter options. And jitter options is just a way of saying random. So how much random size you want implemented, random flow, random angle, and random position. So if I go ahead and drag this, we can see it's pretty all over the place. Let's go ahead and make that brush pretty small. Let's go ahead and see there. And if we go ahead and crank these up, we can see how it's kind of affecting those and giving us a much more wild and random look. I'm going to go over here and choose another brush to kind of look at. Here we have the alignment options. So the alignment options are in reference as to how it's going to align to the object. So let's look at an edge here. And you can see that if we come here to the edge, that it kind of starts to rotate around the edge, and that's with a tangent planar alignment. You have a tangent wrap, which will give you a similar but slightly different kind of use case scenario. So if you're running into issues there, you can play with both of those. Then we have the camera view, which will just stay flat to the camera. And then we have the UV view, which can be really interesting. So we can see here, now in this particular example, we only have one UV island, but when you begin painting on this layer, it will only lock into that UV and it won't paint outside of that UV. So that can be really useful when you have multiple UV islands and you have pieces kind of cut out and you just want to focus on painting one UV. Notice also you can paint over here as well. And if you hold Control here, you will get some of your brush shortcuts, as with many other things. Let's go back here. Let's turn this back to tangent planar. And let's look at backface culling. So backface culling allows you to kind of prevent it from going through the backface, and then you can kind of adjust that angle there. In the size space, you can choose for object, viewport, texture. So here's where you can drag various alphas. So if you remember, we had these alphas over here, and you can see that some of these brushes are actually included in there. So you can go ahead and make your own brush presets. You can also import your own alphas and create those. It becomes incredibly useful when you want to paint patterns or logos on the thing, and you can kind of stamp them in there. And then you have the attributes, which will just give you a bit of information about that alpha. Below that, you have dynamic stroke, where you can go ahead and change some inputs there as well. That's not as often used. Let's come down here to advanced blending. You can choose the stamps blending mode. A lot of this here is going to kind of pertain to the alpha and the stamps. Here we have stencil. We'll get into that later, but stencils are incredibly useful for painting kind of stencils of your alphas onto different objects, and you can import grunge masks, and we'll dive into that later. Down here we have all the traditional layer controls. And I kind of went over these before, but I'll just mention again, you can turn those channels on and off. And the difference between the paint and the fill layer is that this is kind of a destructive workflow. So you can go ahead, you can grab your red there, can go ahead and paint red. You can come over here to green. You can go ahead and paint the green and so on. And you can just continually adjust these here. So you can modify the height and decide that here you want to paint high. And then now you kind of want to paint low. So you can see how they can be extremely powerful. If you are trained in the classical techniques of painting at all, you can see that there is endless possibilities here of how you can paint your texture, how you can paint in details, and how you can really kind of work it to your advantage. Now, one of the things that I think is a bit cumbersome is that the only way to change the color as of this version is to click down here. And as of this version, there are no shortcuts for the eyedrop tool. So if you want to get to the eyedrop tool, you have to click the color first, and then you can click the color. Now, people have brought this up in suggestions, and the Substance team is really good about listening to the community and implementing those features to make it more useful for artists. So hopefully in the future, we'll see color palettes in kind of a eyedropper fill tool like Photoshop, where we can just hold a shortcut. And one great thing about the eyedropper tool is that you can actually grab that eyedropper tool and you can drag it off screen if you have a second screen or another window open. And the power of that is that one kind of workaround I found in not having a color palette is that I will have a picture or a window or another application with my color palette open or a reference image, and I'll just keep dragging that eyedropper off and kind of picking colors from there to paint over here. And then of course you can also pick colors from here as well, a common technique for painters, to kind of pick their in-between blend modes. Now, as we mentioned before, all these layers do have kind of traditional blending modes. So you could go ahead, paint everything orange, and then you could come back, create a multiply, and kind of paint in some shadows if you wanted. And with that, that's kind of an overview of the painting tools. And you can kind of see that there's a lot of power there, that you have the ability to kind of paint with these Photoshop-like brushes onto your 3D model with such speed. I've seen that a lot of 3D applications, like when you try and bring things over to Photoshop, I've noticed that it can be a bit laggy at times, and this is just very fast, seamless workflow, and being able to have access to all these other tools here to just kind of implement in and save time as you go. So now that we've kind of covered the basic kind of painting workflow, let's take a look at kind of Smart Materials and Smart Masks, because that's really the broad appeal of Substance Painter, is that it can save you a lot of this manual labor. So let's take a look at those next.